Hello and welcome to our first IIEA Insights of the autumn with me, Dan O'Brien. Even by the standards of recent years, much has changed in US politics over the past 6 weeks. But opinion polls suggest that Donald Trump's chances of re-election have fallen only slightly since the Democratic candidate changed in July. In other words, the probability of his return to the White House is considerable. The impact for Ireland and Europe, and indeed the world, of such an outcome would likely to be much more consequential than his often chaotic first term. He carries through on just one promise alone to impose import tariffs of at least 10% on all goods that enter the US. Ireland faces a Brexit-scale challenge, given our uniquely close ties with the US compared to other EU members. Recall that the value of Irish goods exports to the US last year was 4 times greater than those to Britain. Pharmaceuticals alone accounted for 25.5 billion euro, and organic chemicals another 11 billion in export value to the US. In today's discussion, we will fast forward to the end of January 2025, assume Trump is again president, and that he is moving quickly to impose his promised tariffs. How will exporters to the EU in Ireland and across to the US in Ireland and across the EU react to these new barriers? What can Ireland and the EU do to water down the tariffs and/or seek exemptions from? What sort of retaliatory measures will the European Commission, which conducts external trade policy for all members of the bloc, consider in response? How should the Irish government and other EU governments seek to influence the Commission's retaliatory response? And what if Trump links trade and security, threatening, for example, to withdraw from NATO if retaliatory tariffs are imposed on US goods coming into Europe? Joining us to weigh up the scale of these risks are Alicia Garci Herrero, Chief Asia Pacific Economist at Natixis Bank and a Senior Fellow at Brussels-based Bruegel think tank; Rory Montgomery, former Permanent Representative of Ireland to the EU and a central player in the Brexit negotiations; and Matt Moran, former head of IBEX Biopharmachem Ireland and currently a consultant in that industry. Welcome to you all, and thanks for joining us. Rory, can we kick off with you? What could the Irish government do to mitigate the risks for Irish exports into the US? And is there a threat that this, or is it, in my view, this issue not getting the attention it deserves? Perhaps because during the first term, the impact on Irish trade, transatlantic trade indeed, was minimal despite all the noise from Trump and the trade spat that existed. Are we under preparing for this risk?
Well, good afternoon, everybody, and thank you, Dan, for the invitation. I'm not sure about whether we're under preparing or not. I know that former colleagues of mine in the Department of Foreign Affairs, Department of Enterprise, Trade and Employment, and indeed the Embassy Washington are putting a lot of work into analysis of what might possibly happen. And I know that this is true also of probably every other member state, and certainly of the European institutions, in particular the Commission. I suppose the problem is there are two problems. I mean, the first of all is to estimate the likelihood of this happening. And secondly, if something does happen, exactly what form will it take? And that is, I think, quite a challenge in planning. Clearly, if there is, as Trump has suggested, an across-the-board 10% tariff, then on all goods entering the US, then there's very little scope for the Irish government, to do anything at all. If, on the other hand, this threat is being used as a kind of a bargaining chip, and the Americans do go, as for example, after the Boeing Airbus spat, and after the imposition of tariffs, with the imposition of tariffs on steel and aluminium, if they go after a selection of items, then clearly, we have a vested interest in trying to ensure that as many Irish goods as possible are kept out of the reach of those selective tariffs. But I think we could possibly be underestimating the scale of the threat. I mean, to use the cliche which was popular at the time, there were grown-ups in the room for much of Trump's first term, people like Gary Cohn in Treasury and Wilbur Ross, or Mnuchin in Treasury and Gary Cohn and Wilbur Ross. I'm not sure that will be the case next time around if he gets in. I mean, certainly the indications are that it'll be much more a case of letting Trump be Trump. and that has difficulties, which I'll come on to later, for engagement with the new Trump administration. But as I say, I think we will obviously be continuing to work very hard within the European frameworks in Brussels, with partners also in Washington. But as I say, if it's a blanket tariff, then really what matters alone is the collective EU response. And of course, we have a say in that, but it's only a relatively small say, notwithstanding the fact that the scale of our trade with the US gives us a larger stake than might be the case purely on the basis of population or GDP.
And exactly that issue of the collective response of Europe. Alicia, how do you see the national capitals, the Commission, all of the European diplomats in Brussels, including the EU mission? How do you see them coordinating in terms of how they try and dissuade Trump from doing this? Do you think that they have a strong case? And also in terms of the response, do you think it's possible that the EU would do exactly whatever Trump does? In other words, put a 10% tariff on all US goods, or do you think they would try and dial it down and be more selective?
Thanks for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here and to talk to an Irish audience. It's really nice because, as you said it very rightly, this is so important for Ireland. But I have to tell you, it's important for the whole world. Let me give you a couple of figures that would really illustrate how important the American economy has become for, say, Germany. Before, China was the largest export market for Germany. It isn't anymore. But I have to go closer to where I'm sitting now in Taipei to say that this is the case of Taiwan. I mean, Taiwan's largest export market now is the US, not China. And that is true for South Korea. That is true for Japan. That is true for ASEAN. So if you think about that, in a way, the question is, who will pay for this tariff? Maybe that's the first thing we would need to ask ourselves. So, if everybody, of course, China will get 60, supposedly. So let's bar China, because China will be hit the most. That's very clear in many ways, not only tariffs. But if we forget about China for a while and we look at everybody else, the question is it the US consumer going to pay? Because there's very few options, i.e. this tax is going to be imposed on everybody. And of course, if that's the case, would you retaliate? You wouldn't, because maybe then Trump's reaction will be 20 for you and maybe 10 for the other. So if I were the Commission, I would not retaliate, because this is a global tariff except for China. So for me, as an economist, I just would say, let's hope that my goods have low price elasticity, and that therefore, are somewhat protected from Trump's decision to impose tariffs. I guess the second thing I would do if I were the Commission is to work on those 60% products. So what does it mean for something produced in China to be confronted with the 60% tariff? Can I benefit from that? Will there be trade diversion towards me? That, for me, that would be the second thing I would look into. Which are the products where I can make a difference, because the tariffs are going to be so much higher for China, and therefore I would try to work on those upfront to see what we can do to compete with China in the US market. This is already happening for many products. You have 100% tariff already on EVs. Maybe 100% tariff is not enough for us to compete in the EV market. Well, it's 100 plus 60 plus what more? Maybe what we thought we would never be able to compete against might become a competition field. Just as an example, today I read about CATL, so this famous, largest, by the way, EV battery maker in China. And you wouldn't expect that company not to do well, would you? I mean, it's like they're gaining market share. China's already 70% of electric battery market share, and they're not doing well. And it's quite interesting. And why? Because the degree of protectionism that they are facing in many ways is really hitting and therefore producing additional overcapacity, which is not allowing them to differentiate against products, et cetera, et cetera. So long story short, we might actually, and this is ironic because we're thinking about everything negative coming from Trump, but I just want to kind of give a different angle that it might actually create some room for some of our sectors that are indeed in trouble at the moment. And that is only because of the differential tariff between China and Europe and the rest of the world for that matter. Yeah.
Okay, so that's really interesting. So you think it could actually boost European competitiveness by squeezing the Chinese out of the US market and allowing Europeans to sell more with a bigger price differential. Okay, that's great.
Yes.
Alicia, just
not for every product. Let's not exaggerate. If you tell me ICT, I would tell you no way, because we don't have any ICT industry. It would have to be there where we're close to China, and that's that these are not very many industries, because China has a competitive advantage in many more, even with a 60% tariff, because we just don't produce those goods. But okay, exactly. I just want to stop there, just not to sound too crazy to the public. I just want to say that we need to look for the silver lining in as far as we cannot change this decision.
Yeah.
If it's taken. So we need to look at how to deal with it.
And just another follow-up. You said that you feel the Commission may not respond at all. In trade
I said I would not respond at all. I would not, because there's no gain to be made from that response, because Trump can then do more for some, less for others. And that would be worse for us if we respond.
You wouldn't fear that by not retaliating, that it's just a sign that there's no downside for Trump, that he can do this again, he can ratchet it up to 20%, that just in trade diplomacy, you need to have a credible sort of deterrence effect?
For retaliation, you need indispensability. You need to be indispensable on something. We have one product in Europe, which is ASML, one company and one specific product, which fulfills the criteria of indispensability. You need to be basically a monopoly and have, price power. We don't have many of those industries in Europe. So therefore, I think it's very dangerous for us to retaliate, because we just don't have the leverage to retaliate. And therefore, I think it would be much smarter to play a different game, is to basically suck away the products that the market that China will lose towards Europe. And by the way, this is exactly what South Korea has been doing with IRA. And the Reduction Act, yeah. So I would follow the Korean way rather than, just fight back Trump. I think that's a very bad idea, in my view.
Okay, great. Matt,
done.
How are you feeling about this, and how do you think that Irish-based exporters to the US would feel about having 10% slapped on to everything they sell into the US? Would they start considering the classic move by companies, tariff jumping? You shift production out of the country that's hit with the tariffs and into the country that's imposing the tariffs. How big a risk is that for the pharmaceutical industry?
Yeah, well, on the face of it, of course, it's a risk. And if you look at the potential impact of a 10% tariff on pharmaceutical products, there's a couple that you could consider. And it's interesting, Alicia referenced consumers. An obvious impact is increase the price of medicines by 10% in the market receiving the product from Ireland, if that tariff stays in place. And that presents probably a very difficult political conundrum for whoever is the president of the USA, whether that be Harris or Trump, because they both made much about reducing the price of medicines. So that's politically would be difficult for them. So that moves on to the next option, which you referred to. Irish medicines are now less competitive. Therefore, you might look at the possibility of switching the locus of production from Ireland into sort of continental USA or behind the tariff. That's on the face of it, you could do that, but I think that the caveat is there's a huge amount of devil in the detail, and that you would need parallel capacity to make the products that you have exported to the USA. And funnily enough, if you look at the flow, the 25 billion euro flow into the US, you'll see around about 3/4 of those products are actually what we call high tech or biotech products. And these are the modern products, these brand new plants that you see being built by companies such as Pfizer, Bristol Myers Squibb, Eli Lilly around the country at the moment, often feted by the IIEA as being great examples of success. These are the products which are being exported to the US. That capacity does not exist in the USA at the moment, as far as I'm aware. So therefore, you'll find them scratching their heads. Do we switch it? If we do, we need to build the capacity. Now, building capacity in the pharmaceutical industry is a minimum 3-year process, because you have to build a plant, validate the plant, get the people, train the people, so on and so forth. So there is a bit of complexity there. And another interesting point, and you referenced what we call organic chemicals, which in the main are the ingredients that go into medicines, also being exported to the USA, about 10 billion. This references then the issue of supply chain, and supply chain is a big issue for the pharmaceutical industry, because most of these supply chains are highly complex. Often they start in Asia and end up in the USA. So if you put that tariff in, you could interrupt supply chain flows, which would again be bad news for the pharmaceutical industry. I mean, the ultimate impact, obviously, of a switch of tariff could be a job loss for the industry in Ireland. So, I mean, I'd finish up by saying, of course, it's a risk. I think there's detail. What can Ireland do? I mean, I would be a bit more parochial and say that Ireland would need to look to its pharmaceutical industrial base and ensure that it has the supports that it needs. When I used to work for IBEC, we spoke a lot about the need for a life sciences strategy for the industry. Got no real response from government in that regard. I'm still a bit flabbergasted that industry, so important, total exports around about 130 billion, does not have a sectoral strategy. So I think that this is an opportunity for government to be reminded that, it's not an industry without risks, not an industry without threats. And we would need to sort of ensure that, I'm there talking about, is the industry deploying digital technologies as best it can to reduce its cost base, possibly mitigate the impact of tariffs? Is it meeting its obligations in terms of sustainability, so on and so forth? So that's just food for thought, but obviously a threat, but there's a huge amount of detail. And it's interesting, Dan, even when Trump promised last time round that he was going to bring the jobs back to the States, that didn't happen.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. Very interested on the sectoral strategy. Maybe we at the Institute could bring a round table of stakeholders together to sort of discuss that and bring ideas together. But that's for another day. Just following up, Matt, if the Commission decides to impose tariffs on US imports, how much more serious would that be? As Alicia says, perhaps that won't happen, and particularly given the security situation and not wanting, if Trump links it with NATO membership, for example. But let's just imagine that the Commission does respond. It imposes some sort of tariffs on imports of products that are inputs into the industry here. Yeah. Does that increase the likelihood of American firms in particular deciding, okay, this is a long-term thing. We're going to look at that 3-year time frame and build out capacity in the US to make sure that we can supply the US market?
Well, funnily enough, if the EU did impose a tariff, it might benefit the industry in Ireland, because you think of it, this is for the outputs. You're outside the tariff, so that the temptation would be to transfer more production outside the tariff and avoid the tariff. On the input question, inputs generally are quite low going into the industry. I think the total is about 6 or 7 billion coming into the country. It's quite small in relative to the exports. The majority of the value is created by the process and by the deployment of the intellectual property within the process. It's not an industry which has got huge raw material costs. There's a massive value add that takes place. So yes, obviously an issue. I think any sort of trade war is not good for an industry which is quite conservative and likes to predict its, I suppose, pricing scenario out into the future. But yeah, I mean, the ironic thing is that possibly it could benefit Ireland. I'm just throwing that out there because we would be outside that tariff.
Okay,
Messy.
interesting. Another possibly positive element to this scenario. Rory, coming back to you in terms of Irish influence. Now, if this all gets messy, and it could very easily get messy, where U.S. companies themselves start telling the administration that this would be bad for American consumers and have some influence. What is the influence of Irish American, the Irish diplomatic service in the US? Would it be fair to say that it's somewhat declined over time, but there are plenty of people with Irish backgrounds in the Trump family, so to speak, movement. How much influence could Ireland have, and how can it work with companies that are based here to mitigate this risk and maybe exempt Ireland if that's possible?
Well, I think that even it's still the case. I think that the Irish embassy in Washington and the government in general, are a larger presence on the lobbying stage than size alone would suggest. However, I wouldn't exaggerate that. The reality is that Irish America, in the classic old style sense, is no longer really a factor in American politics. I mean, you don't have large communities defining themselves as ethnically Irish or Catholic, indeed, in places like Boston and Chicago. I think the last time around with Trump, we were fortunate in that quite a few people we were dealing with had strong Irish connections. And I know that our former ambassador, Dan Mulhall, and his colleagues had a particularly close relationship with Mick Mulvaney, who was the chief of staff to Trump. But that was kind of accidental. And the mere fact that somebody is Irish American, it may be helpful in getting you in through the door, but it doesn't necessarily affect the way decisions are taken. And I was told the story that the US Trade Representative, Robert Lighthizer, was actually Robert Emmett Lighthizer. He had Irish ancestry. And indeed, I heard that Commissioner Hogan, when he went to visit him, presented him with a copy of Emmett's speeches, which were of no interest whatever to him, really, as I understand. So, yes, we have an influence. As I say, that influence would more be exercised in the event that you didn't have a blanket tariff. I mean, if you had a blanket tariff, we would be in the same boat as every other member state, and we would be working with the Commission. And in the overall strategy would have to be determined. And whether it was, as Alicia suggests, a kind of decision to let the Americans shoot themselves and shoot their economy in the foot, and not to do the same ourselves, but we'd be part of a collective effort. As I say, there are some examples in the past, though, of kind of specific products where our lobbying has been of some specific interest. I mean, the most important actually isn't specifically trade related in the sense of narrow trade policy, but it came with the imposition of sanctions on Auchinleach Alumina in the wake of the Skripal affair, and a great deal of work was put in to getting Auchinleach Alumina effectively exempted from those sanctions. And we worked very closely with European aluminium producers, but also with people in the States who are using the product. And again, there are all sorts of interlinkages. I mean, US drinks firms, for example, often have stakes in European drinks firms. It's the same sort of, the same people are concerned at both ends of the market. So as I say, you can't rely simply on Irish America. You have to talk to everybody, but Irish America can help open a door, perhaps. But part of it, as I said at the beginning, is the difficulty of knowing who exactly will be around Trump. I mean, I heard an anecdote to the effect that when somebody was talking to Gary Cohn, someone I know was talking to Gary Cohn, who was the economic advisor, and Cohn was trying to explain how he had tried to make clear to Trump just what the negative effects of tariffs would be. And he said with some frustration afterwards, well, you can't really talk to somebody who has no ears. And I don't know that, we just don't know who will be around Trump. Certainly there are figures like Peter Navarro who will take, I suppose, a rather ideological position and will be very hard to reach. The other example, I suppose, as well as aluminum, was when the US in the Boeing Airbus case imposed exceptional retaliatory tariffs on a whole range of European goods, including butter and cheese and whiskey, cream liqueurs, and we've successfully negotiated the removal of Southern Irish whiskey from the list. The whiskey produced in Northern Ireland continued to be within the general under the rubric of British whiskey. So we were, so that and the aluminum are examples of when, in a practical, granular way, working extremely closely with the companies themselves and their lobbyists in the States. But as I say, I think this can be useful and perhaps at more than the margins, but it's not in itself determinative.
Okay, good. Alicia, widening it out to Europe and the EU, the recovery in Europe is looking very fragile. Manufacturing industry in Germany is undergoing maybe a structural change. The transatlantic trade relationship is massively important. If it were to be seriously disrupted, how bad could that have an effect on the wider European economy at this moment of fragility?
Well, as I was mentioning, the US has become more important, not less important for Europe, partially because of IRA. I mean, we are also beneficiaries, maybe not us Europeans, but our companies are beneficiaries in as far as they benefit from subsidies in the US, which maybe is hollowing out partially our economy through lower investment. But the point is that if that were to stop, and this is Trump's, an additional angle to Trump's policies, is that he might actually undo IRA, or he might undo the benefits for countries outside of the US or companies outside of the US. So that's another hit on at least our companies and their repatriated profits that they may achieve thanks to access to IRA. So, it's not really, this won't happen at the right time, for sure. There's never a right time, but certainly it's a very difficult time for Germany, also because there's no spare wheel, in my view. I mean, we can't expect the Chinese economy to grow any faster anytime, in my opinion, in the foreseeable future. It's like a structural deceleration for many, many reasons, which go beyond this seminar. So, there's nowhere else to go. You could think India, you could think Africa, but, all of these engines are much smaller, yeah? The Indian economy is 1/5 of that of China. So, and by the way, Germany is not exposed to India. So it would have to work on the exposure first, and maybe in 10 years, benefit from that exposure. So it is indeed a major shock, I would say, that, if the US turns more inward looking, whether it's investment, whether it's trade, it's really not the right time for Europe to go through this, I have to say.
Yeah. Matt, in terms of the industry, in the past, criticism of Ireland's corporation tax came mostly from continental Europe, French and Germans, even though, as I always say to French and German colleagues, look at your own tax revenue, corporation tax revenues. They've been going up over time, and I always highlighted this. But the US, I'm increasingly hearing people in the US in the economics profession, the policymaking profession, being disgruntled at Ireland because there is definitely profit shifting happening in different sectors, including the pharma sector. We saw only yesterday new corporation tax figures, gargantuan sums of money being booked here. Do you hear in the industry concerns about this in the US, that American companies are coming under pressure along the lines of, why are American companies manufacturing pharmaceuticals in other countries to sell to Americans, and not unrealistic position or not crazily protectionist position? Do you hear that sort of, is that pressure mounting in some way in the industry, or is it just not that relevant? It's commentary.
It's obviously it's an issue, Dan, and it might sort of general sort of talk within the US, it might come up. It's not something that's particularly an important issue at a company level. But having said that, it's all, I mean, if you work for a multinational pharmaceutical company, your competition is always internal. So, I mean, they're used to having to compete for investment with their own sites. So, you know, I worked in the industry myself. So often your chief competitor was not, if you work for Pfizer, it wasn't Eli Lilly, it was Pfizer in New York. That was your competitor, or Pfizer in Connecticut. So that's a world they're used to. And it's interesting when you actually work, you have to remember that Ireland is a sourcing location for the industry. It's a profit center, and it's used to generate products. There's a lot of substance there, so it's backed by significant manufacturing on the ground. So it's not, you know, it's not a tax play per se, and without substance backing it. So that's there. And the second thing, I suppose, having worked in operations, you're judged by how efficiently and how productively you operate, and they leave the tax out of the equation, funnily enough. So, I mean, if you're running an operation making medicines, your main priority obviously is the quality of the medicine, because the patient is your customer. And secondly, then to do that as efficiently as you possibly can. So that's the world these guys exist in. So yes, obviously, it doesn't look good that you know, American companies are exploiting lower rates of tax to supply drugs to American patients. But on the other hand, those who work within the industry are used to, I suppose, a very much an operation-focused environment, and they spend most of the energy trying to produce these medicines as efficiently and to as high quality as they can. And it's always worth saying, and I always say it, I said it previously when I worked for IBEC, that one of Ireland's significant attractors for the pharmaceutical industry is its second to none levels of quality and ability to deliver highly regulated products every time, right first time, every time. And that's a critical issue for the pharmaceutical industry, because you can talk about costs, you can talk about tariffs, you can talk about any cost. But if you have a product which fails, or one that gets out into the market and you have a recall, the damage to the company is far more severe, and the damage can be fatal. And I know more than one company and the damage was fatal. So a lot of the focus of those who work within the industry is, again, operations, do it right first time, comply with regulation, and maintain the reputation of the country as a renowned source for making these products. And I think I'll finish up, but you have to remember that Ireland is recognised as being one of the leading locations for the manufacture of pharmaceuticals and biopharmaceutical products in the world.
And that's presumably a human capital thing. There's a lot of people with a lot of experience, and you can't just, you know, relocate tens of thousands of people.
And it's taken a long time to build that up. And as you probably also know, the level of collaboration that takes place within the industry in Ireland is an advantage. And I mean, they utilize that. I mean, and the ultimate beneficiary obviously will be the patient, obviously, and obviously the beneficiary is the country, because it's a great employer and generates huge value. I mean, over half the exports in goods that leave this country come from the pharmaceutical and biopharmaceutical industry.
Rory, can I go over to you? And I certainly don't want to make this all about economics. The huge change since Trump was last in the White House is that there's a full-scale war on our continent. We're still highly dependent on the United States for our security, and there are questions as to whether the United States would maintain its security guarantee. What do you think? Is there a possibility, just to bring it slightly to trade and segue into it, do you think there's a possibility the US could link the security guarantees, its membership of NATO, Article 5, with telling the Europeans not to retaliate on trade, and entirely separately from the trade issue? How worried are you about further deterioration in the European security environment if Trump returns to the White House?
Just before I answer that, two very quick points in response to things which have been said earlier. The first is that I think there is a large amount of opposition building up in the US political establishment, and particularly among Republicans, to the OECD tax deal, which we thought had kind of resolved the issue for a period, and a sense that the US somehow has given away is giving away its corporation tax, what it should be getting. So that has obvious implications for Ireland. The second thing is that, of course, the overall political environment at the moment in the US is pretty bad for free trade. I mean, the Democrats are also playing the same game to a considerable extent. I mean, Biden confirmed that Japanese company would not be allowed to take over US Steel, for example, just the other day. And there are clear those are clear problems, and there is and Biden has he has maintained quite a lot of the Trump tariffs, even if he's reached a truce with the EU. On the bigger question, no, you're absolutely right. I mean, again, nobody quite knows how Trump thinks, and as I say, nobody quite knows who the people around him will be. But there's no doubt that all of this will be seen together as part of a whole. That there's the people who are annoying him over trade, maybe are also in some cases the same people who aren't paying their share in NATO, or he would argue to Ukraine, although that's to ignore all that the EU has done in a non-military way for Ukraine. And there is, but I think the really important geopolitical element in all this is China, because China, as Alicia was pointing out, would be the big loser from what has been proposed or what is being speculated about so far. And the EU is trying to tread a fairly fine line, I think, between the US and the EU and China up to now. And, to not to go as far as the US and seeing China as a rival, and trying to sort of, to some extent, moderate some of the American hostility towards China, which is very, very deep rooted now in both parties. So I suppose, in a certain way, to the extent that Europe was seen to be sort of joining in the US effort against China to a greater extent, that might, make the new administration a bit more forgiving or tolerant when it comes to EU-US trade. But as I say, Trump is transactional. He believes himself, against much of the evidence, to be an absolutely first-class negotiator, a master of the art of the deal. So I think he will very probably use all of these pieces in one way or another. So there could be read across, maybe not in an absolutely direct quid pro quo way, but the overall atmosphere will certainly be affected by how these other issues that you mentioned develop.
Thanks, Rory. Alicia, in terms of the European response to a deterioration of relations across the Atlantic, do you think that it would strengthen those who advocate strategic autonomy for Europe, whatever exactly that means? Do you think Europeans would move rapidly towards greater defense spending and cooperation if there is a real question over American security guarantees? How do you think it would affect the internal debate in Europe about what Europe does collectively?
Well, I would start by saying that it has already affected our commission. If you look at the composition of the commission, I mean, the role of both security and in terms of new commissioners, but also economic security, how much we have expanded in a way, whether it's national or economic security, I think is an obvious consequence of a potential Trump administration. Now, of course, will this be real? I mean, will we really do this for real? That's a different question. And that will, I guess, it will only be for real if Trump wins the elections, to me. I mean, the rest will remain, okay, we love strategic autonomy, but, with the Harris administration, my feeling is we'll keep on working on these TTCs, the Trade and Technology Council. I mean, we'll keep on kind of hoping that the US is always there in a way or another, whether it's in terms of setting guidelines towards de-risking, even if supposedly we were first in coming up with that concept. But the reality is that, all of the export controls, coordination, everything's coming from the US. So I just feel that the real push for strategic autonomy will only be there if Trump wins the elections, and that's even what he did in the first term will be enough. I mean, we don't need an even more disruptive Trump for the EU to start really putting money in its own defense and perhaps coordinating export controls much more tightly, or introducing outbound investment screening, you name it, all of that, I think will be with Trump something that we will cook on our own rather than with the US. And I think it will be very different with Harris, because there will be a benefit from coordinating. It will be a benefit. There will be a benefit from accepting the US kind of power or to determine those rules, which is, again, what we have today. IRA access, maybe not good for Europe, but for our companies. But with Trump, I don't think we'll get any of that. So we will go towards your point, strategic autonomy, no doubt.
Matt, just want to finish up with you. I get the sense, and correct me if I'm wrong, but you feel the industry here is quite resilient. It's clearly, as you mentioned, got a whole number of reasons to be here. Would that mean that overall you think that the industry could weather a very serious transatlantic trade storm with tariffs, possibly even more tariffs than the 10%? Would you sort of conclude for us, and possibly, if I've interpreted correctly, you think this is not a sort of an existential threat to the industry here?
Yeah, I mean, it's not an extent. I mean, it obviously is a threat, Dan, but I don't believe it's an existential threat for the reasons I've outlined, mainly because of the, I suppose, ability of the industry to develop capacity to manufacture these products. And that takes time in the industry. And, you know, if you look at the sums that these companies have invested in manufacturing plants in Ireland, you're looking at MSD, 2 billion, Pfizer, 2 billion, Lilly, 2 billion, so on and so forth. These are significant investments and sophisticated investments. I think the companies will see them out, Dan, you know.
Okay. So it's you certainly wouldn't expect, given the sunk costs, anybody to up sticks, but it could affect the pipeline for future investments.
It's all about pipeline in the future. Yeah, absolutely.
Great. Good. Look, we have hit the 45-minute mark just about. Let me thank our three speakers for giving us their time, not just today, but in preparation for today's event, the work that went into it. Thank all my colleagues as well for our first event back. Next Insights in 2 weeks, we'll be focusing on the British government, the new British government, and Ireland's relations with Britain's relations with the EU. So we look forward to welcoming you to that. And thank to all our members who came today. Have a very good afternoon. Thanks, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Dan.